it's Kim. So today what I wanted to talk about is um derealization. So basically I was isolated a lot as a child, and so I would spend hours in my head, and some part of myself would become attached to those fantasy reality I was living in inside of my brain, like escaping from trauma by creating those worlds where either one of my parents would come and save me and bring me places. And those fantasy I used to live used to feel so true to me that I would believe them. And what happened to me is because I was living so many realities in my brain, some were fantasy, some weren't, that at some point I couldn't see the line between them. And I'll always remember this event where one of my parents ended up telling everyone I was lying. And the problem is I wasn't lying, it's just that reality and fantasy had intertwined so much that I didn't know what was real and what wasn't because of the isolation. I was so isolated in my bedroom all the time. I was punished for months on end in my bedroom without being allowed to come out. And plus, I had a hard time making friends. So what would happen is that would isolate me too. And then when I did have friends, I would have people ending up on trying to ruin my friendship, as if they were trying to make sure I had no friends. And because they didn't understand me and my fantasy and reality issues and the derealization that was happening in my brain, what would happen is that I would lose friends that way. And it happened so many times that one of my parents would do that. They would make sure that I had no friends. I don't know if they did it purposefully or they just didn't want people to know what they were doing in the dark. Because some of it was real, some of it was just hard to know. So I would say the good things that would happen in my fantasy to create this sort of comfort that I had created in my brain. So I would talk about it because for me it was real, because I was living it. I was just living it inside my fantasy world. And then I would have the reality, which I would talk about too, the abuse that would be happening. But then because I had so much fantasy reality problem, what would happen is that I would end up losing friends that way, because a parent would say, oh, she's lying. So everyone would believe I was lying, which from the external world can look like lying because those things never happen in reality. But because they happened in my fantasy, for me, they were real. At least for the part that had that fantasy, that was real. Um, and that was hard to navigate because I was already having a hard time making friends, because I would have different parts of me coming on and be different. So it was really hard for me making friends. But plus, I had a parent in the back just making sure I didn't have friends. I don't know if they did it purposefully. That I'll never know, because how can I know that? Especially, I don't talk to my parents right now. Well, at least I don't. I don't know if other parts of me do, but I don't talk to my parents. Um, well, apparently, sometimes the little parts of myself do talk to my parents. I had to like go into my brain and ask questions because we're learning to communicate, right? We're learning to communicate, and because I'm the one who talks about our situation, those parts will tell me little bits and pieces. But yeah, so because we don't talk to our parents, most of us, except some little parts sometimes. Um, I don't know where I was going with this. But yeah, so we had this fantasy world inside of our brain that would be going on, and it would intertwine with reality, which would make me look like I was lying when I wasn't. And because of those amnesia gaps that I have, certain things may seem as a certain way to certain parts of myself, while other parts knew the truth, but were hiding it. And that was like a big thing in our life, is that people would often think we were lying because of those amnesia gaps, because we would also live in a fantasy reality. Because what would happen is we would often spend time, well, at least some part of us would spend a lot of time at the bottom of the closet in the dark. There was a shelf in the middle of the closet, which would make like a space just big enough for us to put a blanket down on the ground and just cry for hours. And then that's where we would create all those fantasy where a hero would come and save us. And those fantasies, they just became reality eventually, which caused a lot of kerfuffle in our lives. And like for a long time, we didn't know that we had different parts in our brain. For a very long time, we thought they were just imaginary friends. And then after that, when we were laughed at for having imaginary friends, they just became the voice in our mind. For a while, we thought people were coming into our brain and talking to us, which that was delusion for sure, because nobody's coming into our brain to talk to us. We can't like telepathically communicate with people. But that was for a long time, that's what we thought, until we realized that those were our voice. They were just different. There was just different voices inside our brain. But for a long time, we thought it was other people talking to us. And like I've said before, I know I've said this before, but at 21, we told a social worker that we had voices in our brain that would tell us to do things, and we couldn't control ourselves, and we did it. Now that we know that, like, it's just different parts of our brain discussing between each other, we've learned to communicate a little bit better, and we're still learning to communicate, which is difficult at times because like we have little parts that don't need to know everything, and those little parts get really depressed. Some of them, not all of them, but some of those little parts get really depressed, and like to a point where they're hopeless. And that's when we end up calling for help, because those little parts need that help. And because we can't really choose where we're going in our brain all the time, those little parts get lonely, and then they start being really sad and really lost, and they don't know what to do. That's a big part of what's happening in our brain. we're gonna leave it at that for today. It was nice talking a bit about our experience, and we appreciate all those who take the time to hear it. Um, talk to you later.